Watch a single foraging ant closely enough, and you'll notice something that should be genuinely impossible given what she's actually working with. She wanders outward from her nest in a winding, seemingly random path, covering considerable distance across uneven, cluttered terrain past grass blades that must look, at her scale, like an impenetrable forest, around rocks the size of small buildings relative to her body. And yet, the moment she finds something worth bringing home, she doesn't retrace that same winding path back. She turns and walks in a nearly straight line, directly toward the nest entrance, often a route she has never physically walked before in her life. This shouldn't be possible for an animal with the visual capability ants actually have. Ant eyesight, contrary to what most people assume, is genuinely poor by almost any standard comparison, blurry low resolution, and in many species barely capable of distinguishing basic shapes beyond a very short range. And yet ants are widely regarded by researchers studying animal navigation as among the most reliable navigators in the entire natural world, capable of feats of direction finding that would be genuinely impressive even for an animal with excellent vision. Today, we're going to explain exactly how an ant accomplishes this, using a combination of biological tools considerably stranger and more sophisticated than most people would ever guess an insect the size of a grain of rice could actually possess. Before explaining how ants navigate so successfully, it's worth being specific about exactly how limited their visual capability genuinely is, since the gap between poor eyesight and reliable navigation is precisely what makes the rest of this story so remarkable. Ants possess compound eyes made up of numerous individual ommatidia, but in most common ant species, the total number of these units is genuinely small compared for sharper vision, such as dragonflies or many species of fly, resulting in an overall image resolution researchers describe as considerably below in detail, capable of detecting movement and brightness at relatively short range, but essentially incapable of the kind of detailed, long-distance navigation many people instinctively assume must be involved when they watch an ant across a complex landscape. Some ant species, particularly those living primarily underground or within dense leaf litter, have reduced eyes even further, and in a small number of specialized species, functional eyesight is almost entirely absent, relying instead on non-visual senses for essentially all navigation and environmental awareness. Given this genuinely limited visual toolkit across the group as a whole, the reliable, often remarkably direct route-finding ants consistently demonstrate cannot be explained by vision alone, and researchers studying ant navigation have spent decades identifying the actual combination of alternative systems responsible for filling this gap. Perhaps the single most surprising navigational tool in an ant's toolkit is one that sounds almost too strange to be true. Many ant species, extensively studied in a desert dwelling called cataglyphs, quite literally count their own steps, using this internal step count to calculate distance traveled as part of a broader navigational system researchers call path integration. The experimental evidence behind this discovery is genuinely elegant. Researchers studying cataglyphs ants attached tiny stilts to the legs of foraging ants after they had already traveled a set distance outward from their nest, artificially lengthening their stride, and separately shortened the legs of other ants through careful trimming. In both cases, the ant's return journey toward the nest was thrown off in a way predictable by the stride length. Specifically, ants' stilts consistently overshot the actual nest location, walking too far before stopping, while ants consistently undershot it, stopping short of the actual nest entrance, a result that would make no sense unless the genuinely relying on an internal count ups taken, combined with an assumed stride length, to calculate exactly how far they'd traveled, rather than relying on external visual or environmental reference for that specific piece of the calculation. This step-counting mechanism functions as one half of a broader system called path integration, in which an ant continuously tracks both the distance traveled, using this internal step count, and the direction of travel, using the mechanism covered in the next section, updating a running mental calculation throughout her entire outward journey that allows her to compute a direct return vector back toward the nest at any point, regardless of how winding or indirect her actual outward path happened to be. The direction tracking half of this path integration system relies on a genuinely remarkable sensory capability most humans have no direct experience of at all: the ability to detect and use the polarization pattern of sunlight scattered across the sky as a reliable, continuously available compass reference. Sunlight, as it scatters through Earth's atmosphere, becomes polarized in specific patterns that shift in a predictable, consistent relative to the sun's position, patterns invisible to human eyes but clearly detectable by specialized photoreceptor cells found in a specific region of an ant's compound eye, an area researchers refer to as the dorsal rim area, positioned specifically to scan the sky rather than the ground-level surroundings the rest of the compound eye is generally used for. By continuously sampling this polarization pattern as she moves and changes direction, an ant maintains a running, precise sense of her current heading relative to the sun's position, functioning as a genuinely reliable compass that remains usable even under significant cloud cover, since polarization patterns persist in detectable form across considerable portions of the sky even when the sun itself isn't directly visible. Researchers studying this system have specifically dated its function through experiments involving polarizing filters placed over ant navigation routes, artificially rotating the perceived polarization pattern and observing ants correspondingly and predictably shift their walking direction in response, confirm that this specific sensory input, rather than any visual landmark recognition, was driving the direction tracking side of the navigation calculation being tested. Combined with the step counting distance covered in the previous section, this sky-based compass allows an ant to maintain a continuously updated, remarkably accurate internal vector pointing directly back toward her nest, calculated fresh at every moment throughout a winding, indirect, outward foraging journey, entirely independent of whether she can actually see the nest or much of anything else in detail at any given point along the way. Beyond the internally calculated path integration system covered above, ants supplement their navigation with the pheromone trail system, discussed extensively in earlier videos on this channel, a chemical layer of information laid down and can continuously refreshed by successful foragers, providing an additional, externally verifiable navigational reference that works alongside, rather than instead of, the internal step counting and sky compass systems already covered. This combination is genuinely important to understand as a complementary system rather than a redundant backup, since each mechanism compensates for specific weaknesses in the others. Path integration, while remarkably accurate over reasonably short distances, does accumulate small errors over the course of a long, winding journey, similar in principle to how dead reckoning navigation methods used historically in ships and aircraft gradually off course without periodic correction from an external reference point. Pheromone trails, meanwhile, provide exactly this kind of periodic external correction, allowing a foraging ant to confirm and fine-tune her position relative to a known, chemically marked route, particularly valuable during the final approach toward the nest entrance itself, where precision matters considerably more than during the broader, more forgiving middle portion of a foraging journey. Researchers studying ants specifically documented ants switching fluidly between reliance on pheromone trail, depending on which system offers more reliable information, default to integration calculations when venturing into genuinely novel territory with no existing chemical trail present, and increasing relying on trail following once an established chemical available, a flexible, layered navigational strategy that restudying animal cognition have particularly sophisticated example of multi-systems integration for an animal with such a comparatively small nervous system. Despite the genuinely poor visual resolution covered in the second section, ants do make some visual information in navigation, though in a considerably more limited and specific way than most people would assume, relying primarily on the recognition of general shapes, contrast patterns, and the overall visual skyline surrounding familiar territory, rather than the kind of detailed landmark recognition a human navigating by sight would rely on. Researchers studying ant landmark learning that ants foraging along familiar, frequently traveled routes do form a general visual scene along that specific path, including the rough silhouette formed by surrounding vegetation, structures, or terrains of the sky. Using this coarse visual memory as yet another layer of confirmation alongside migration and pheromone trail following, particularly useful for finding the final stages of a return journey once the ant has moved close enough to a familiar area for even her limited visual resolution to recognizable general shapes and contrast patterns. This landmark memory system, while genuinely limited compared to visual navigation from many other eye-on, illustrates the broader pattern of this entire video. Rather than depending heavily on any single sensory system, ant navigates through the combination and integration of several visually imperfect systems, each compensating from the others, producing an overall navigational reliability that exceeds what any single of these systems could achieve on its own, a genuinely elegant biological solution to the limitations of operating with a brain and sensory system as small as an ant's actually is. The specific navigational strategies throughout this video have attracted sustained interest well beyond simple about ant behavior, because the underlying computationals involved, path integrations and direction tracking, multi-sensoration compensating for individual sensory weaknesses, between internal calculation and external environmental reference depending on which is more reliable in a given moment, closely parallel challenges engineers face when designing autonomous navigation systems and small-scale drone technology that need to operate reliably in environments where GPS signal reliable or entirely unavailable. Researchers working in robotics and autonomous navigation have ant navigation research, including the polarized light compass system covered above, as direct inspiration for developing alternative, biologically inspired navigation systems for small robotic platforms, an area of applied research often with bio-inspired or biomimetic navigation, illustrating how understandingly sophisticated problem-solving, hang inside an insect with a brain small ed, continues to offer genuinely practical insight well beyond the boundaries of entomology as a field. Given everything covered above, here's how to actually observe this navigational system in action the next time you're watching ants in your own garden. Watch a foraging ant's outward journey closely, and note how winding and indirect it typically appears, reflecting genuine exploratory searching behavior, rather than any predetermined route. Since as covered above, the ant isn't following a known path outward in the way she will on her return trip. Once she finds something worth carrying home, watch her turn and observe the directness of her return path, particularly noticeable if you can track her over an open, relatively unobstructed area like a patio or driveway, where the contrast between her winding outward search and her considerably more direct homeward journey becomes genuinely visible even without any specialized equipment. If you're specifically interested in observing the pheromone trail component discussed earlier, watch for the emergence of an increasingly straight, well-worn path over the course of several hours or days, as covered in earlier videos on this channel, reflecting the trail reinforcement process building on top of, and eventually partially replacing reliance individual ants' internal path integration calculations for that specific, repeatedly traveled route. Consider the sky conditions during your observation, since as covered above, the polarized light compass system remains functional under significant cloud cover, meaning you can genuinely observe reasonably accurate ant navigation continuing on a partly overcast day, a subtle but interesting confirmation of just how robust this particular sensory system actually is compared to a simple reliance on direct sunlight visibility alone. The single ant navigating confidently across your patio, despite genuinely poor eyesight and a brain smaller than a grain of rice, represents a navigational system that took researchers considerable effort and genuinely creative experimentation, including the stilt and leg shortening studies covered earlier, to fully understand and document. Step counting distance tracking, a sky-based polarization compass invisible to human perception, chemical trail confirmation, and coarse landmark memory, all weather continuously, compensating for each other's individual limitations to produce a level of navigational reliability that would be genuinely impressive in an animal many times an ant's size and neural complexity. The next time you watch an ant wander what looks like an aimless, meandering path across your yard, only to turn and walk directly home, she finds something worth carrying. Know that you're watching several distinct, independently evolved sensory and computational systems working in continuous coordination, a level of navigational sophistication considerably more impressive than her poor eyesight alone would ever suggest was possible. Have you ever watched an ant take a winding path outward, then walk almost perfectly straight back home? Now that you know how she actually does it change how you look at ants in your own yard? Tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and sometimes your stories become the subject of the next video. And if you've ever wondered what another small creature quietly living in your yard actually knows about your world, I think the next video might surprise you just as much as this one did. Until then, keep watching, keep wondering, and never stop paying attention to the small things.